and hydration that you need to start the day. I want to say that unfortunately, Catherine Hawley was unavoidably prevented from joining us here today due to personal reasons, and our thoughts are with her. However, I am pleased as punch to introduce our first keynote interview featuring two people I admire so incredibly much. Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee is a senior fellow in governance studies and the director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution, as well as the co-editor-in-chief of Think Tank. She'll be interviewed about her work and thinking on questions of and around trust by Angelique Carson, the director of content at Asana, and among other things, the former host of the Privacy Advisor podcast with the International Association of Privacy Professionals, or IAPP. If that introduction doesn't let you know, we will be trying to avoid any unnecessary acronyms today, or at least spelling them out for you. So without further ado, join me in welcoming Angelique and Nicole.
Hi, everybody. How are you? It's good to be with you, Nicole. Hi there. Yes, thank you for the wonderful introduction, Amy, and apologies that I am not the person, Nicole and I, neither of us are the people that you were expecting on the agenda, but we are going to do our best to give you a great session. And based on Nicole's extensive expertise, I'm sure we're going to have no trouble doing that. As Amy said, we are going to try to avoid using acronyms, knowing that we have folks from all different sectors and interests and areas of expertise here. So we will try and be aware of that as much as possible. So let's just jump right in. Oh, one more note, we will take questions towards the end of this half-hour session. So you can put your questions right into the Q&A section of the Zoom, and we will get to as many of them as we can. So let's jump right into it. Nicole, thank you so much for being here, especially on short notice. I haven't had the opportunity to interview you before, but I'm thrilled to do so. Let's start out just kind of setting the stage. We want to use this conversation as sort of a framing for the rest of the event. So Nicole, can you talk to us a little bit about the scope of your work at Brookings and how you think about issues around technology, both its strengths and inevitable shortcomings?
Oh, no, thank you, Angelique. And Amy, thank you. I got the call, and obviously I'm a huge fan of the program, and I'm a huge fan of Amy. She's done it for me at Brookings, and I'm just reciprocating, so no worries. Plus, it wasn't one of those time zones that would have forced me to wake up very, very early, so it actually was a win-win. With that being said, I want to just thank everybody for attending, and thank you for coming to this session. As it was mentioned, I am Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee. I'm a sociologist by training, so just to clear the air in terms of the fact that I'm not a lawyer, just want to put that out there. But I'm one who has actually looked at digital issues from a regulatory and legislative perspective for quite some time. So at Brookings, I lead our Center for Technology Innovation, and I'm also a senior fellow there. And at the Center for Technology Innovation, or CTI as we call it, we're focused on really coming up with evidence-based policymaking and research that assist in moving the needle when it comes to a host of digital issues, whether it's privacy, infrastructure, conversations on spectrum policy, artificial intelligence. The host of scholars at CTI really spend a lot of time making sure that we translate it into layman's terms, but we also are very forward thinking when it comes to solutions. In addition to holding that position at CTI and dabbling in those host of areas that I just mentioned, I also lead our artificial intelligence work, particularly the stream that is related to AI bias. So as a sociologist, you might say to yourself, well, how does she do this in addition to everything else? I have a book coming out as well, shameless plug, on the US digital divide later this year. But I do it because at the intersection of technology are sociological implications. And it's really important as we have this conversation this morning that we continue to think about what impact is the context in which we deploy emerging technological models to, what's the impact on groups that may be vulnerable or underserved? How do we begin to look at and harness the power of technology in ways that are less pernicious? And how do we also stay prepared for the unintended consequences that a technology or a host of technologies may have on groups that have already experienced levels of systemic inequality, particularly racism, sexism, homophobic attitudes, etc. And so that's why I spend a lot of my time as well, really creating these intersections, particularly on the artificial intelligence space, with how those systems overlap, Angelique, with some really serious concerns that we have societally that also have the ability to disenfranchise or further disenfranchise particular communities.
Excellent. And, such important topics that really have, genuinely real and drastic impacts on people's lives, as you note. So important issues to think about that aren't just sort of academic, they have real life implications. So I appreciate the work that you're doing very much, as well as your colleagues in your space. Let's talk a little bit more about AI and AI-driven decisions. When you look at this, what are the primary obstacles that you really see?
Yeah, this is such a big topic, and I know we have a limited amount of time, so I'm going to actually try to keep it concise. So, I'd like to look at artificial intelligence systems and autonomous systems as sort of Internet 2.0. We've already gone through what I think is this transactional internet that actually has moved from a static internet into one where we have computers harnessing the best aptitudes of humans in ways that are much more expeditious in their decision making and potentially more precise. With that being the case, one thing that we tend to forget when we think about the world of artificial intelligence is that computers are not biased, people are. And so when you begin to think about the values, assumptions, and norms that factor into the development of models, what people's perspectives are that actually get baked into these systems, it starts out, inevitably, it starts out from a flawed condition. And let me just share an example of what I mean by that. There are many criminal justice algorithms that are on market right now that are helping judges, for example, in their sentencing decisions or their bail decisions, trying to determine with huge caseloads whether somebody should be detained or released. When they use artificial intelligence models or what we call machine learning algorithms, those algorithms are being trained on data that inherently over criminalizes or over incarcerates Black people or Brown people or people who are poor. And as a result of that, those populations get overrepresented in the training data that actually provides the algorithm sort of the route or the direction in which it needs to go. And so, from that perspective, it's very important to actually combine what you're talking about today. What is the framework for what we're automating? Should we be automating this function at all, really, right? Because there are some things that we probably just need to leave alone. And then three, if we decide to go that route, to what extent are we putting in checks and balances to ensure that we do not have huge unintended consequences? Because as I speak to my engineering friends, I have to just share this. I enjoy being like the sociologist on a panel with engineers. It's almost like playing a game of Scrabble or playing a game of Monopoly with someone who's really not a game player. Like you're just sort of sitting there trying to figure this out as it goes. Well, in my sense, when I sit with engineers, there's this assumption in artificial intelligence that systems are mathematics and science are discrete, they're objective. But I think for this audience, particularly an audience of legal scholars, it's not. There's an interpretation to everything. And so, what I feel in this space, though we can harness the good of artificial intelligence systems to help us do a host of things, solve problems in healthcare, solve problems when it comes to education, look at the ways in which we can improve upon climate change. But there are also these sociological implications that, in the end of the day, have the potential to sort of encroach upon civil rights and human liberties. And to me, that is where we as policymakers really need to come together to figure this out.
So let's dive into that a little bit. AI is being deployed constantly and increasingly. As it's being increasingly deployed, as you say, U.S. judges are using algorithms to determine bail and sentencing limits. That can produce incorrect decisions. People are going to jail maybe when they shouldn't, or for longer, or being denied, loans based on algorithms that are unfairly treating them. We see the FBI using facial recognition to try and target criminals, and we see minorities disproportionately affected by that. While all of these things are happening with real life implications, what are the best strategies we can use to really tackle problems like that?
That is such a great question. And so, for those of you who may be wondering, well, how did Brookings get involved with this? I mean, we started in this space a few years ago, and actually 3 years to be exact. And just the other day, we were rated as the #1 think tank globally to deal with AI policy related issues. I mean, generally at Brookings, we have a stream that looks at governance. What does international domestic governance look like when you're looking at AI systems, bias, which I run, and then the third stream is around foreign policy implications. So what do you do with all this? I mean, I think first and foremost, policymakers have to assume that they really know nothing about the scientific, mathematical side of this business. I don't, and I do not profess to know what that means. And historically, we've sort of set it up where there's this imaginary black box in the middle, and on the one side of it are inputs, and on the other side are outputs. Policymakers are concerned with the outputs, as you mentioned, Angelique, the denial of loans or credit or other streams where people are excluded from opportunity. I define bias, for example, as a case where people who are similarly situated places, people, and objects receive either different treatment or have disparate impacts. So on that output side, we as policymakers are actually concerned around that. But on the input side, I think a lot of developers that I have interviewed in my own research are interested in trying to figure out how to do this right. They're not necessarily going in with explicit bias, but again, those norms and assumptions and values do temper how they create their models. Another great example on this, just before I go on, a healthcare algorithm was developed a couple of years ago or last year, and it was for people with chronic disease. It used a variable of how much money people paid into healthcare. And as a result, it kicked out every Black patient that had applied because we know that there's a correlation between low investments in healthcare by communities who have less access to healthcare. And so, even though those variables may be identified as being less biased because it doesn't include race or gender or sexual orientation or age, it turns out that the black box is so significant because once the model leaves the lab, it picks up on the historical occurrences, the likes, the affinity groups, the interests that we all have. So, one of the things that I've been trying to do as a sociologist is to do a couple of things. One is to come up with a framework for how you push out an interdisciplinary perspective in sensitive use cases like financial services, employment, healthcare. I've been proposing this model called an Energy Star rating. It came out of the fact that I needed a new dishwasher. I went to a big box store and I saw that big yellow sticker who told me how much water, how much energy, how much electricity, etc., would be consumed. And in many respects, as they're doing in Germany, for example, we need some type of labeling because at the end of the day, this is not necessarily about whether or not an algorithm is racist. It also is about whether or not it performs well in a variety of contexts. So I think we need to look at what's the technical cadence as part of my Energy Star rating. What is the training data that is being used? Is it over sampling on respondents or people or places or things that tend to be predatory subjects? What's the decision that's being made? And is there a human audit, whether it's from me as a person of color who says, hey, don't send me any more pawnbrokers to my website, or if it's something else, it actually creates a feedback loop. We definitely need to combine these strategies to push industry to be much better in their self-regulation, but to also prescribe certain statutes like civil rights protections, like accountability measures and policy to push the envelope on this. Because at the end of the day, and I'll just say this, these decisions matter. I like blue dresses. I will buy a blue dress in a heartbeat. I had to figure out which blue dress I was wearing today because I've been on so many of these. I didn't want to actually have the same dress I had on yesterday. But at the end of the day, when that blue dress also identifies me as a woman of color, a woman with kids, a woman who may shop too much, and as LaTanya Sweeney's work at Harvard suggests, I may get served predatory credit card offerings, then the algorithm is biased and it has a potential for disparate impact. So I think we're seeing a lot more conversation in the space around what are some best technical practices, what are some policy prescriptions at IAPP, we're actually seeing conversations around that as well. I've been involved with those, but we definitely need to do something. We are coming out of a stage, and with COVID, our data is our currency right now, and there's been a whole lot of it floating out there. So we'll see much more deception then we will see proactive activity to remedy these harms without some type of intervention.
let me ask you, I'm curious about the human side of this, because as we know, humans are biased and they're the ones feeding the algorithms. There's all sorts of good work being done by yourself and your colleagues in some of the groups that you mentioned. How do we work on the human side? How do we get into the rooms where people are making decisions and help them make better decisions? How do we take the conversation out of circles like this, which are very important, but put it into the hands or put it in front of the people who are charged with ultimately making decisions that are going to, impact minority or vulnerable groups?
Yeah, as my daughter was saying, she was listening to me last night. She was making fun of me. She said, "You talk about the same stuff, mommy, every day. I hear it all the time." So I'm going to tell everybody here. If you've heard me say it before, you're going to hear me say it again. First and foremost, we have to start out with the structural lack of diversity within these structures of companies that actually create these algorithms and programs that generate the pipeline for our future computer scientists, engineers, and data scientists. We have to solve that problem because when we're talking about the deployment of general purpose algorithms, we're no longer talking about it for the sake of just general science. We're talking about algorithms that make determinations on whether a product is delivered to your neighborhood, whether you qualify for a healthcare program or a loan, whether you stay in jail longer than someone else. So we need to have interdisciplinary, multicultural work teams that start out at the table with, hey, do we want to go down this route when it comes to automating this particular problem or this particular challenge? I am a sociologist, folks. I am not an engineer. I did not pass computer science when I was in college, but I bring a different perspective based on the settled research that we have when it comes to social institutions and equity. Secondly, it's really important once we have that solved for companies to have in place impact assessments. Many of the colleagues that are on this call perhaps have looked at the auditing process. Are there civil rights audits? Are there general audits, again, determining the performance of the algorithm? Technical cadence. NIST here in Washington, D.C. is responsible for not necessarily rulemaking, but putting together best practices or standards. We've actually seen this process happen internationally. The extent to which we apply those lessons are particularly important as well. And then I would say, generally, how do we actually ensure some type of protection? We don't have federal privacy legislation in this country, and Amy knows how passionate Brookings is about that. When you do not have any guardrails to sort of suggest what type of data you can collect, how long you can keep it, etc., you run the risk of actually creating a wild, wild west that creates these mistakes before they actually have productive course towards avoiding the unintended consequences. I think those things are particularly important. Now, there are areas that we can push the envelope when you talk about diversity. One of the things I've suggested is facial recognition technology, for example, doesn't recognize people of darker skin tones. So as a result, we have seen several cases of proprietary software that does not see, in the case of the Congressional Black Caucus members, most of them were identified as criminals because of the misidentification of the software. We're seeing since January 6th, my friends, white insurrectionists being carefully identified, and a black man in Detroit sat in the police station for 6 hours just a few weeks prior because he was pulled off the street because of a facial recognition tool. It does not necessarily mean that we fully ban these things. It means that they have to get better. Because as I said at the beginning, there's always the balance between the public good as well as these bad actors that and functions of these technologies that may emerge. But what I say to that too, Angelique, is there's also space for us to co-evolve. I tell people all the time, if you don't have enough Black women in your data set, then let's figure out how to get some more in there. Because as our general purpose technology, it's important to be inclusive and representative. So I would add this when people talk about responsible AI, explainable AI, interpretable AI, that we put in inclusive AI. And that I think is the next course of how we should be looking at this technology that is ultimately going to continue to transform our lives.
What do you think about, are we on the right track to getting people in the room, to getting minorities into the room, the rooms where decisions are being made? I know that, for example, I think personally, it seems to me that companies are increasingly seeing this problem and are increasingly doing the right thing or trying to, in terms of hiring minorities to be, engineers or in the C-suite, et cetera. Do you see us on the right track there, or do we have a lot of work to do?
We've got a lot of work to do, honestly. I mean, and it's just not, just having a person of color in the room. It's having a person of color in the room that understands the lived experiences of the groups that we're trying to protect. At the end of the day, diversity and inclusion only works well when that person has a seat at the table. There's this wonderful chart, since you're going this route, that I saw on LinkedIn that I often use when I talk about diversity. It's the differences between equality and equity. Equality in this picture is everybody looking at a baseball game. There's a tall person, a mid-sized person, and a really short person. And the analogy is that the tall person could see this game without any boxes. The mid-sized person maybe needs one box, and the really short person needs about 4 or 5 boxes to actually get to the tall person. That's equality, because what can you do? You can give your short person a box, and ultimately, in maybe 10, 15, 20 boxes, they'll be able to see this baseball game. But equity assumes that the people that you're actually bringing in have some decision making capacity and they have a seat at the table. It's no secret that when people are at the table, they're able to make decisions that actually make sense either for a company, an organization, and even in your household. That to me is where we should be striving. In this analogy that I'm referring to, no one needs a box because guess what? They can all stand on the field and see the same baseball game. That is where we should be going in AI. I cannot tell you enough, Angelique, how many groups I talk to, how many companies I talk to, how many civil society organizations I speak to. And part of what I've been impressing upon them, this is almost like this conversation that we had when it came to whether or not we should have chief diversity officers within companies. We have to have diversity throughout the food chain, lawyers, engineers, customer service agents, etc. But we have to also be intentional and strategic. And that's really what I've been pushing people. If you're sitting in a room and there's a model that kind of gives you an intuitive feeling that this is going to have an impact, like an algorithm that may actually contain so much information and disinformation that thousands of insurrectionists go to the Capitol believing that it is a stolen election, you need to sit back and think about the liability that's encased in that model. And I'll just leave it here. Part of the challenge of actually solving this is that our algorithmic economy is so strong. It's like when I was a kid, we'd go out to the playground. Some people would be on the slide, some people would be on the monkey bars, some people would be in the sandbox. And every once in a while, we get up and we do something else. In this new digital economy, the Black nationalists or Black Lives Matter people on the slides, the white supremacists are sitting in the sandbox, the bicyclists are sitting over there somewhere in the monkey bars, and nobody talks to each other. And so that extent of polarized speech has lent itself to an algorithmic community that amplifies hate and mistrust and disinformation that, to your point, without the appropriate people who can flag those behaviors, we're not going to solve this. And I personally think that, there's just a couple things for lawyers that are listening. You have to apply civil rights statutes to any type of technological advancement. Anything that is created within a lab has to comply with the Fair Housing Act, Credit Act, Employment Act, healthcare rules, etc. You start there, compliance-driven development. And then from there, you begin to, again, look and manage the impacts of how that algorithm performs in a variety of settings.
Let's turn a little bit to some of the focus of the conference here before we move to questions shortly. It seems more than ever, consumers are nervous about giving their data away, about working with technology. We've seen increasing headlines ever since the GDPR came into force, and so we saw regulators making headlines, issuing fines for companies who've done the wrong thing. We had the Facebook Cambridge Analytica thing, which really seemed to alert some customers to the fact that this was even going on. Customers that didn't used to pay attention, now we're seeing headlines about, do you know where your data is going, who it's being shared with. So it seems we're entering into sort of to me, like a consumer revolution. But what's your take on that? Is this lack of trust in tech tools new, or are we entering a new phase of mistrust in companies and also government institutions?
It's so funny that you asked that question. I'm sort of looking at this in my new book in terms of, this build up to how we got to such pernicious behavior when it comes to some of these things that, we think are just everyday activities like shopping or, going online to greet family and friends. The bottom line is this. I mean, we have come out of a regulated system of telecommunications and technology where many of the companies that we're talking about just have gone unregulated. And that is no fault of any of us. I mean, when Michael Powell and Bill Kennard came up with the idea of an unregulated mobile internet ecosystem that eventually led to mobile technologies and what we're seeing today, that light touch regulation had consequences that are now being experienced. The difference today versus yesterday is that we're no longer talking about bits and bytes, we're talking about content. And that content that is replacing content that used to be trusted sources of information. And without going down the Section 230 path, what I would say is that also is complicated by a more complex ecosystem that allows limited media diversity and where people could actually go to get that trusted source of information. So what does that lead us in terms of that? I mean, honestly, I think law enforcement and policing of this type of content is important. And we're going to see more and more of that come out of this new administration in terms of what do content moderation strategies look like? What's the extent of enforcement that we're going to see at agencies like the Federal Trade Commission playing a huge role, I think, in this next stage of the internet. The FCC and Federal Communications Commission being really mindful that the other challenge that we've not talked about today is that if you are not online, you are not part of anybody's product. So as a result, it's sort of a limitation on the type of products that are distributed to you. And, on top of that is this historical underpinning of what do we do with this move towards racial equity and understanding, which has already been part of the tribalization of this country and in terms of our pockets. It's a big, big challenge to have. And on top of that, I hate to say it, we're still in the middle of a pandemic. And so when you put all that together, we have to kind of go back to the course of communications generally in our country and our history. We had it so that we were ensuring that everybody had the ability to participate in civil life and political life. And now we have a tool that it contributes to the economic livelihood of us. If you're not online and you're not in line because there's nothing open, essentially, right? And so to your point, it is important to have rules of the road, starting with privacy. What is the conduct that we actually prefer in this country that will give us a glide path towards both suitable as well as protectionable attributes that consumers understand, industries understand, and it puts us at least on the level playing field. Of course, there's always going to be deceptive actors. There will always be people who take advantage of the poor and the vulnerable. But without rules of the road, it's just going to happen more. And so we need to ensure that we have that going forward. I also think, and I was on a panel with acting chairwoman Rebecca Slaughter, who really blew my mind with this statement, we need to have an approach to antitrust that looks at issues like this, that applies a racial equity framework to how we look at market power and market differentiation and how we address these issues. Right now, we have several Post-it notes that are flying around based on what you said, Angelique, a variety of situations that have arisen in the last few years, the perfect storm, but we haven't framed them. And so it's important for us to frame them using, our legal wit, in addition to the centering of people and what protections they need going forward. So I would just say, at Brookings, this is a complicated issue. I mean, a little shout out to us as we go into questions. We have a podcast, the Tech Take podcast, that addresses these issues. We also have our Tech Take newsletter, and we partner with groups like yours to just try to figure out how we solve these issues in a forward-thinking way. But I would say this, the train has left the station. Policymakers are going to be behind no matter how you cut it. And so again, coming up with constructive rules of the road and guidelines in those areas where we feel there will be the most consumer harm is really important. And that cuts across a variety of verticals from antitrust all the way down to the digital divide and how we actually proceed forward.
Great. Well, let's move to questions. I believe we have a student from Colorado Law School, Ameka Webb, here to ask the first question.
Hi, yeah, my name's Ameka Webb. I'm actually a junior in computer science at CU Boulder. And my question for you, as someone who is interested in pursuing a career in data science, is what's your best resource or any resource suggestions for people like me who want to dive in deeper into this topic?
I mean, go for it. We need more women in this space, right? And we need more people who can be sensitized to the interdisciplinary context of data science. I mean, for those of you listening, data science is a big open hole right now and is looking for people to come fill it. I had somebody ask me recently, Amika, if I would go into this and get any more education. I said no, because there are going to be plenty of people like yourself that will do a darn good job in making sure that we fill in the holes. I do think when you go into this space, try to find programs that also intersect ethics and they intersect other things that we talked about in terms of the human concern. I do believe that in the future, we're not going to see data scientists go through school just for data science. I do believe we'll actually see more wraparounds. And so if you can get a head start on that, I think that's even going to be better for where the industry is going to lead. Thank you for that question too.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Amika. Question for you, Dr. Turner here. Sherwin asks, should there be a difference in how we view inclusivity in different types of systems? For example, is making facial recognition and surveillance tech better able to recognize people of color what we want, particularly given that the technology is being applied in social systems that are already biased?
Yeah, I love that question, Sherwin, because I found myself sort of caught between that. Like, should we just go with the ban because we're basically doing a proof of concept that it doesn't work well with people of color or people with darker skin hues? I personally think that we actually have to keep pressing forward to make it work better. The commercialized applications of facial recognition, they have differential impact when it comes to the more, centralized applications like criminalization, et cetera, that have direct social impacts. But that doesn't mean that we foreclose any opportunity to ensure that the people who are designing the technology are inclusive and the technology is better suited to serve those populations. If we don't do that, then we're going to still have the mishaps in the commercial side of it. People who cannot open, a phone because the face is not fully recognized. Autonomous vehicles that still hit a Black kid over a tree because it's still not clear how the technology works. So we're actually doing a project at Brookings right now, which is some of you may be involved in the future, which is really looking at facial recognition technologies from a technical perspective, but then also seeing what type of guardrails need to be applied in law enforcement. There's the possibility to be narrow in approach that allows us to fully use the technology without foreclosing on the opportunities that all Americans should have with this technology, both in the commercial and the public sector. But to your point, this should not be run reckless, where people get access to it and they don't know how to use it. That's something that we think is really important when it infringes upon civil rights.
Great. And one last question here before we send it back to Amy. And, this is one that I often think about. We think about algorithms as, the black box, and a lot of companies will cite, proprietary information if we're asking them to, I have editors who hate when I use phrases like this, but, open up the kimono or lift the hood. So this question is, how can one prove AI bias when you can't track the transaction?
Woo! I think that's why I have this Energy Star rating, because I think at the end of the day, we're going to move towards systems that have to perform well regardless of context of people. And I think it's important that civil society actually have input into this. If this is not me, I want to be able to tell that company that you are actually creating the wrong profile or your information is surveilling me wrong. With that being the case, I don't think any of us will truly understand what is in the black box until we see, for example, government hire more AI ethicists or AI engineers to sit alongside them in the policymaking side. I was on a panel with Professor Michael Kearns, who's written this really fabulous book, which basically says you cannot fight AI. You cannot create AI policy without AI engineers and AI language. And so I think to a certain extent, we have to actually create some parity between the two, or we're going to find ourselves picking and choosing where we need to go, harder and more, faster in terms of mitigating some of the consequences. But I do think at the same time that we should move away from this elusive black box. Folks know, based on this research that I've been conducting, what's going into the algorithm. They know when they're optimizing for less bias. They know when they're optimizing for more bias. In fact, my friends, the reason I get micro-targeted blue dresses is because the algorithm already knows that that's my behavior. I think the key thing is to focus our time in those areas, Angelique, to your point, that actually may be those areas that have the greater consequence. And if we were able to do some type of continuum of where we actually see the most harm for consumers, let's start to think about what is it that's happening there. And one last thing I would just suggest to people as we wrap up, part of what's missing in this conversation in the black box is disparate impact and the extent to which we have litmus tests that are embedded in models that trigger, even if using an algorithm to find it, where there's a disparate impact. Doing paneling research, figuring out if there's certain groups that are more susceptible to harm versus others. Those are really important. And we actually see certain companies like the banking companies have these litmus tests when it comes to quantitative modeling. So I would just say to to you and to the people who are listening, I mean, we're working on this at Brookings, and this is really one of my life's goals. It keeps me up at night because wouldn't it be horrible to have the same technology that's opened so many doors and has transformed our culture and our society and our world to be something that goes back and regresses on the civil and human rights protections that many people fought for? We don't want to see that. So let's look at this as a way to make it better, make it more ubiquitous, but at the same time, don't let it run like the wild, wild west. And we turn around and we say, what have we created here? Because we're finding out that we've created the same external realities that we currently live in. Let's not do that. And that's why I think this conversation is so important. And I really wish the conference a lot of luck going forward with these conversations and being very proactive on this.
Great. Well, Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee, thank you so much for your expertise, for sharing it with us today, for your energy on the issue. You can just feel your passion, which is always fun to listen to. And I think we're going to turn it back to Amy. On a personal note, I just would like to say that it's an honor to fill in and to help Amy and her wonderful conference out. She was the first person when I moved to Washington, D.C. I was walking around aimless and friendless and had no idea how to navigate the scene. And she was the first person to take me for coffee and be kind of a mentor. So Amy, best of luck with the rest of this wonderful conference. And thanks so much for having both of us.
I know, and Angelique, don't let me start. Don't let me get my little kick in for Amy. Amy, you are the best, hands down. Hands down. She's somebody that's always reached out to folks, always been there when we've called her. And then this organization overall, I started here learning. So very, very happy to do this.
And thanks to everyone for tuning in and listening on the web. And back to you, Amy.
You two are absolutely the best. Thank you so much for helping kick us off. I can't imagine a more powerful conversation to have had to start this event. And Angelique, you're right, the passion really comes through. And I am deeply appreciative to you both. We are going to take a short break now.